Hi, everyone. Welcome to our digital lecture this week. It's not ideal. This is one of my favorite topics that we discuss together, and usually it has lots of really good back and forth discussion. We unfortunately are doing it all virtually now because of the coronavirus, and it's not ideal, but we'll all pitch in and do the best that we can. So I'm going to try to do this lecture much like I would do in the classroom by showing you different videos and posing questions. Of course, I will not be getting your responses right now, but hopefully we can talk in more about some of the questions that I ask on Google Meet in our next session together there. So this chapter really focuses on representation and the fact that there are large segments of our society that aren't really represented equally through the media, although I do think it's better now than it has been. We'll also talk a lot about stereotypes and how the media does use a lot of stereotypes and why they do them. So I like this photo here. Be mindful about stereotypes. Only one of them is a convicted felon. And of course, we know that that's Martha Stewart. She's the convicted felon for some stock market insider trading that she did years ago. Spent some time in federal prison in West Virginia. And that Snoop Dogg, as far as I know, he's not a felon. So, but it kind of goes against the stereotypes that we would often hold in our minds. So let's get started. We're talking about issues in media representation and how do the media representations of the social world compare to the external, the real world around us. So one way that we can see it is, how is media content similar or not so similar to the real world? And it really focuses on social inequality, the fact that there's lots of TV shows, movies that represent and they reproduce the inequalities of the world around us based on race, class, gender, sexual orientation, etc. So there's a gap between what we see in the real world and what we see on the media. They don't always match up. So, and really, to be honest, most media don't really try to mirror the real world, maybe with the exception of news, documentaries, things like that. But even fantasy products like a sci-fi movie or book, they often teach us something about our society. So there are a lot of significance in our media products, and most media products do make some kind of comment on the world around us. In fact, there's a program starting tonight on HBO that I'm hoping to watch. It's called The Plot Against America. It's based on a Philip Roth book from the early 2000s. And it's about when a celebrity, Charles Lindbergh, who was a hero, a really well-known hero, he was also anti-Semitic and really tied into the support of the Nazi Party. He is an American, lived here. He was asked to run for president in the 1920s. He decided not to do that. But the movie is about what would happen if this celebrity hero became president and allied himself to the Nazi Party. So it has a lot of meaning to what we see in our world today and different things that have happened in America through the years. So that's an example of a fiction, but it's making a comment on our society and our democracy as well. So let's talk about the inequalities that exist in our social world. They're also presented within the media industry. So a lot of that can reflect our media content. And so sometimes it can be because the people who are producing the media, the ones who are paid to produce the media, the writers, the directors, all of them, fit into middle class or upper class, white category. And so they're not really representing voices of other people around our country. So I have this example of Saturday Night Live, which for years has been produced. All the writers and the cast were all white people. I think Eddie Murphy was the first African American, and he was only on there for about a year. And there's been some throughout the years, but they really have, over the past several years, really focused on having a more diverse cast and a more diverse writing group so that they can provide more voices to Americans. And so here's two of the the cast members that were the first African American women to be to be writers and on the crew of Saturday Night Live. So I wanted us to watch this Black Jeopardy skit that they did on Saturday Night Live um, in 2016 with Tom Hanks, and we'll talk some more about that afterwards. So let me get it switched over here. Just like we're in class together, and I'm making sure that you can see what I can see. Audio clip. So I think it's interesting to kind of look at who the producers are of the different media that we have around us. So that is one way that researchers are looking at media content, is who's producing it and how does that affect what they're producing. The next way of looking at media content is content as a reflection of the preference of the audience. What does the audience want to see? So they're trying to draw a certain audience, a likely audience, and so they want to draw more eyeballs because they sell. That's what they sell to the advertisers. That makes them money. So this approach suggests that content is really reflecting what we all want to watch. So kind of giving people what they want. I would argue that, as we've talked about in the past, that a lot of these reality TV shows, yes, we're getting more and more of those because people are watching them. They get interest from people, but also because they are economical. They are cheaper to produce, but yet they are still successful. So that is a way of looking at media content, is what does the audience want? Is that why we're getting the lowest common denominator? Some of the kind of trash TV that we have, because that is what audiences are turning into. The next way that people look at media content is, does our media, is it reflecting our society in general? So is it a gauge of our values, our norms, just the interest of our society in general? Not just the people who are watching the show, but does it reflect our society? Um, I love, just I love criminal type, Law and Order type shows. I'm a big Law and Order fan, and I watched CSI some, but wasn't a big fan of it. But I would probably watch it if it was put in front of me. Um, so is that reflective? Is there a lot of crime and things going on in our society, or is it just drama that we like to see? So researchers would be analyzing that to see, is this reflecting what's happening in our society? Or is it because audiences are interested in it? So they would be looking at it from those perspectives. Then another way to look at content is it influencing audiences? Is it a reflection of the way that audiences respond and maybe take in what they're viewing? Now, this is a real extreme example, but this is the Batman Joker movie. And this is the guy that shot up the movie theater in Colorado during that movie. And he, had tried to look like the Joker and did all kinds of strange things. Now we know that he not probably, has a mental illness, and that has affected much of his decision making. It wasn't just the movie that made him go do this. But the movie could have some type of influence and an effect on certain people. So this is a real extreme example, but there are also lots of researchers who are looking at just the way that, maybe seeing violence on TV or being scared about the coronavirus. What kind of influence is that having on audiences in our country? So, and then the last way is that researchers will just study media content on its own. They won't look really about the producer or the audience. They're just looking at that they said that there's not really a direct link. So they may just be looking at the production process or the social influence. So they're just, kind of looking at it separately. They're trying to take it apart and decode everything. So they might be analyzing the language, the vocabulary, the grammar of something, just to see what kind of influences it may have standing alone by itself. So most researchers believe that it's impossible to examine content without also touching on the role of who's producing it, how are the audiences reacting to it, and then the larger things that are happening in our society that might be affecting the content that is being produced by the media. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at stereotypes. So stereotypes, sorry, I took a little break and now I'm coming back. A stereotype is defined as a generalization about a group of people. And we attribute a defined set of characteristics to that group. So it could be that I have a certain stereotype about a college professor, and instead of looking at each individual separately, I hold that stereotype about every college professor just because they are a college professor. I don't look at them separately and how they might be different. But stereotypes can be positive or negative. So I want us to talk through about why we stereotype and kind of how we learn to do that as well. But we often stereotype because people are very complex. And it's difficult to take in the complexities of it's easier many times just to be kind of simple-minded about it and look at it as black or white and not see the nuances of people because people are very complex. Stereotyping is inaccurate, but it is efficient. So you will see, most, say, TV commercials, if it's on YouTube, it might be a minute. If it's on TV, like in an actual program, it's more like 30 seconds. And so they have a very short window of time to sell their product. And so they often will use stereotyping to communicate something about their product because it's efficient. It saves them time. Your assignment this week after you look at the lecture and take the quiz and read your chapter is to watch a video called Killing Us Softly. And it's about how the advertising industry has stereotyped women for the last several decades. I think you'll find it extremely interesting. It's a really well put together video and study about this. And so it's going to give you some examples about how that stereotyping, it's not accurate, but it is efficient. The way that we categorize, it's, the way that we think, it's a human capability that we have so that we can predict and organize our world. It helps us to put people into categories, and that helps us just our mind. It helps make it simpler. Another reason we stereotype is that it saves us time and it satisfies the need to predict the social world. It might make someone feel more comfortable if they have preconceived notions about someone. They already have their guard up, or they already feel positive about a person, or they feel negative about that person. So they already have those things built inside of them. Also, another reason we stereotype is a lot of people stereotype, especially the negative ones, because they need to feel good about themselves. And so they put other people down, or they think I'm better than that group of people. So because they feel insecure or something, they want to feel better about themselves. And so they're harsh towards other people, and that helps them feel better. Stereotyping can also protect you from anxiety, can enhance your self-esteem. And really our childhood influences are some of the most complex and the most important factors that we have in developing our stereotype. So if you hold certain stereotypes, or your parents do, you may hold those same stereotypes, whether they're true or not. And you're probably at the point in your life now where you may be examining some of those stereotypes and saying, hey, why do I think that way about that religion, or about that race or that gender? And so it's a time for you to kind of question and start developing your own viewpoints about other people. I have my husband grew up in grew up in a very conservative family. They lived in a big area that had a lot of Catholics. And so his parents would say things about Catholics because they were Protestants. His father was a minister, and saying things that were kind of critical of Catholics. So they wouldn't do certain things because that's what the Catholics did. Some of you may be Catholic and you're like, wait, why would someone feel that way? Well, it was a way of stereotyping, and it was something, unfortunately, my husband has broken all those stereotypes. I don't even know that he ever really if they ever came through to him or not. But a lot of people, a lot of kids never break the stereotypes that they learn from their parents. So I think it's important for us all to be aware of those things. You can develop stereotypes from teachers, from your peers around you, best friends or things that their beliefs can influence yours, and also from the media. If you are a frequent media watcher, um, I tell people, we got to cut the cord as much as we can so that we can develop our own mindset and our own viewpoints about the world around us and not be influenced. If you got something in front of you 4 or 5 hours a day, it is going to influence you no matter what you say that, oh no, it doesn't influence me. It will influence you. So it's important for you to be aware of that and just, try to stand back and look and say, hey, do I think this way about that group of people because of my parents or because of the media or whatever it might be? So I think it's important for us all to analyze. Now, negative stereotypes are very oversimplified, they're exaggerated, and they're demeaning. And they are trying to deny certain individuals respect or that they're legitimate people based upon because they are a woman or because they are a man or because they are an athlete or a cheerleader or whatever it might be. They're they are a member of a certain group, and so a lot of groups have certain stereotypes, and maybe people try to see you that way too, even though you may be totally opposite of that, what that stereotype. Negative stereotypes can be hard to dislodge or to change when that dominant group desires to keep another group subordinate. So that's going back to what we talked about before spring break with media ideology and hegemony and all those things that we talked about in that lecture. So stereotypes are also easier to create when there's a visible and consistent attitude that can be recognized. So if someone has a uniform on, it's easy to recognize them as a cop, right? You see a policeman there. Of course, the stereotype is of policemen are always eating donuts. Do not mess with a cop. It could be women can be easily stereotyped because of the way because they are clearly visible as women. It could be people of color because it's clearly visible. So when you can see something that's clearly visible, it can be easier to stereotype someone. It could be even someone that has a Make America Great Again hat on, or someone who has a Hillary bumper sticker on his or her car. So we can stereotype those people, and I think it's important, me included, for us all to try to see people, see their humanity and see who they are, and not just look at them as a stereotype. So I want you to think in your own, in your own mind. We'll talk about this in our Google Meet Friday if we have time. Who are some groups of people that are easily stereotyped? Stereotyping does go beyond race and gender, so I want you to think about geography or hobbies, the way someone dresses, their faith. So write yourself a note, go through and kind of think, or stop the video right now and write yourself a note and say, who are some people that are easily stereotyped that are not just race and gender? Okay, and then we'll talk more about that on Friday. Stereotypes in the media have been around for a long time. They are very common in cultural media. Throughout history, storytellers have used stereotypes. They do that to connect the audience with their story quickly. Shakespeare in The Merchant of Venice, he had a character Shylock who was Jewish and had a lot of stereotypes that people hold about Jewish people. So it's just just an example that stereotypes is not there. It's not something new that we see in our media. So stereotypes are instantly recognizable. So they are very effective in advertising, entertainment, and news. So that's when you want to watch out for it. Anytime you need to make a quick story or a quick article, give them information quickly. So stereotypes are kind of like codes. People to now use the word dog whistles a lot. They give audiences a quick, common understanding of a person or a group of people. And it's usually related to class, race, gender, sexual orientation, so the social role, economic class, their occupation, things like that. So now let's talk about race and ethnicity. Race is socially constructed. The white norm has been what is normal in American media and society. Um, Again, that is changing, and I think that's a really positive thing where we're seeing more voices. We want to have more diversity in all of our media, and I think we are getting that now, where we still have the white norm voice, but then we also have the SNL characters and writers who are African American, and we have more women um, being portrayed in different lights in our media. Your book has some really good information about race and gender and all that. So be sure and be reading those pages about that as well. But a racial signifier signifies that race is an important trait to notice. And many times if there is no racial signifier, then it also is a signal for white, just because that's what has been the majority in our country. So race and media roles. I'm going to take another break and then we'll come back. Okay, so I'm back. I had to get a drink. But we're talking about race and media roles and stereotypes of race and what we're seeing. And again, read your book because it's got some really good examples and explains it thoroughly. But our early images of race, of minorities, we talked about Gone with the Wind last week in class or the week before spring break, and there's a lot of stereotypes about minorities that are presented in the media, especially in the past, where they were the servant, or they were the happy-go-lucky entertainer, or maybe they're the enemy. They're violent. They're criminals. They could be not smart. They're erratic. They're not truly civilized, like the way that many Native Americans were portrayed. The Latin lover. All of those. You could probably break it down. We're going to look at the way that Arabs have been stereotyped as well. And there's a great movie that if we get back to class anytime soon, that I will show you about how Arabs have been stereotyped in movies and still are today. So early television did not have, it had very few minorities on it. There was no one that was Asian or Latino on TV then. But with our growing minority population in our country, we do have more representations of them on TV, and we looked at some of those in class last week as well when we were talking about ideology, like Blackish and Fresh Off the Boat, and just different things that we're seeing. So we're seeing more diversity in our content of media, which I think is a really positive thing. Advertisers are also interested in these markets. In these audiences, these target audiences. So they are interested in that. And so we are also seeing more media content because that is what advertisers want. They want to reach that audience. And so they are wanting to see that type of TV sitcom or drama or whatever it might be. Also, we have so many more media outlets today than we've ever had before. It's almost mind blowing. So. Here's the Arab stereotype. It is a slow change. We still have stereotypes in our media. We are becoming more inclusive, more sensitive, but especially after 9/11, even before that, but just lots of controversial racial and ethnic images. The belligerent Arab, who's wants to, the radical Islamist, whatever it might be, just the imagery that they are presenting. And I really hope that we can get back to class and I can show you that. I haven't been able to find it online yet. And if so, then we may watch it together virtually if we can't get together back in the classroom. So there is also subtle racism where it's kind of below the conscious awareness. It's kind of hidden in those things. Oftentimes, crime stories will overrepresent the Black perpetrator, the criminal, and the white victim. When Hurricane Katrina news coverage was analyzed after the fact, many of the African Americans were shown as being victims or looters. whereas the many of the white portrayals were that they were the rescuers and they were protecting. There's studies that have been done about that when people went and did content analysis and analyzed the news coverage during that time. So many times minorities are presented as being in an underclass. And I think we need to be careful and recognize that subtle racism when it is around us. Women, of course, you all know I'm a feminist. So your book talks about women in the media, women in media control. There are a lot more media jobs now for women. The new president of CBS News is a woman. A lot of the anchors are now women. So we're getting a lot more diversity in that regard. There are more directors and executive level people, not as many as it's not like 50% like our population is, but we do have more. And we are getting more writers, producers, and editors, as we saw with that SNL example. In news, women are largely presented, though, as ordinary people, while men were dominating as experts. And one thing I would like you to do, I already have it pulled up here on my other slide here, is I want you, there's a link there that you can click. The slides will be on Moodle, or you can just find it here. It's aau.org, probably has a long name, aau.org article implicit association test, or you can click the link that is in the slide. And I want you to take this test. Are you biased against women leaders? I think that was one of the um, things that people said about Hillary Clinton, that people just didn't want a woman as president, and that there's still that glass ceiling for some of our really high level positions. So I want you just to take this test. You don't have to tell anyone, unless we'll probably talk about it on Friday. But go ahead and take the test and just see. And if you want to share what you found out, then you can. So once you click this, it will take you to this page here, and you'll go through and answer some questions and then get your results. Okay, so be sure and do that just to test your own, if you have any biases against women as leaders. I bet all of you are pretty forward on that just because of your age. Women in media also, studies have shown that even as of 2012 and 13, men had the majority of reoccurring characters on primetime TV, 55% male, 45% female. And the characters in video games and animated shows are mostly male. And those studies are in your book that you can read more about, but I wanted to point those out. Also, women are often seen as being mothers or homemakers or sexual objects, where they're not seen for their expertise as much. They're focused on family, friends, romance, dating, that type of thing, where men are more likely to be portrayed in work-related activities or high-status activities. And this was even just as of 2008. I want to show you something about women's sports coverage. Women's sports is usually seen as less important than men's sports. It doesn't quite get the huge audiences. Of course, we look at the women's soccer team from this past summer, and they had more audience coverage and more publicity than any of the men, and more of their jerseys were sold than ever before. So we are, we can see some examples of really positive coverage and popularity of women's sports, but not as much. But many times still, women's sports is sexualized. So I want to show you two examples. One is from Wimbledon. As you know, I love tennis. And this was Marion Bartoli, and she won Wimbledon. Pretty sure she won a few years ago. So let me just show you this short clip, and then we'll watch one more as well.
And, well, I just wonder if her dad, because obviously he's been the most influential person in her life, I just wonder if her dad did say to her when she was 12, 13, 14 maybe, listen, you are never going to be, a looker. You are never going to be somebody like a Sharapova who's going to be. You're never going to be 5'11". You're never going to be somebody with long legs. So you have to compensate for that. You are going to have to be the most dogged, determined fighter that anyone has ever seen on the tennis court if you're going to make it. And she kind of is.
Okay, so um, that was a British sportscaster saying, and this was the BBC. Get this, get this off. And then there's one here that was Britt Musburger. Now, this was a girlfriend watching in the stands, but usually, if it was a guy watching his girlfriend play and he was in the stands, this would not be said about him.
Back into the game. When you're a quarterback at Alabama, you see that lovely lady there. She does go to Auburn, I will admit that. But she also, this Alabama, and that's A.J. McCarron's girlfriend, okay? And right there on the right is Dee Dee Bonner. That's A.J.'s mom. Wow, I'm telling you, quarterbacks, you get all the good-looking women. What a beautiful woman. Wow.
A.J.'s doing some things right down in
So if you're a youngster in Alabama, start getting the football out and throw it around the backyard with Pop.
Okay, so boy, he really liked the way she looked, didn't he? And just kind of went on and on and on about it. Again, it's just there is I don't think a female sportscaster would go on and on and on about the guy, the beautiful, handsome boyfriend that's watching the tennis player on the side. So there is, still examples of women being treated differently in sports and in media coverage as well. Also, there's class and media. Most advertisers are trying to target people who have money because people that have money can spend their money. So some advertisers believe that some people are more valuable than others. And in fact, the America that is portrayed in the media is much wealthier than it is in the real world. So it is not truly a mirror of what America is like. If you go overseas and you're talking to people and their impressions of Americans, they think everyone's wealthy. And we all know that's not the case. But that is very much the portrayal because the America portrayed in the media content is wealthier than in the real world. Also, there is an underrepresentation of working class families. Roseanne was a big show that came out and was very popular and great show. And it was because, it showed a working class family in a positive way. I think Archie Bunker probably was a working class family too in the 1970s, but haven't been a lot of them. There has been that overrepresentation of the glamorous professional jobs and more of a negative portrayal of the working class. Um, so the implication is that working class individuals are blamed for their failures and not really looking at the structural problems in our society that may be also causing some of those problems. It's not just the person themselves. And then there's sexual orientation in media. The early media portrayals of gays, lesbians, bis, and trans were that they were deviant, that they were always funny, they were very marginalized, unhappy. We are seeing a lot of it is because of Ellen, that there's increasing coverage of gays and LGBTQ plus in our media. And this was the cover of Time magazine when Ellen came out. She had her sitcom then, lost her sitcom after coming out. But then, of course, she has been very successful with her talk show, her stand-up comedy, everything that she does. And she's extremely popular and extremely successful. Um, so we are getting more representation of sexual orientations in the mainstream media. However, and I have noticed that this is changing. A lot of times it's non-sexualized. They're just the best friend. Um, so there's still some of the stereotypes about the gay man that's always girly. I do think we're seeing some examples of that is changing with Modern Family maybe or some other TV shows and Netflix shows that are showing them in a more broad way. So. Western movies, of course. The good guy was the cowboy in the white hat and was always honorable and courageous. And then the bad guy was the cowboy in the black hat, and he was selfish and devious. And the Indian was always portrayed, the Native American, as guilty, a savage, dangerous. So there's a lot of really clear-cut stereotypes in Western movies. My dad loves Western movies. And now that there's no sports on TV, I bet he's watching a lot of Western movies. And then there's others that you see, like even stereotypes from school programs, like Glee is a good example of that. They've got the typical group of high school stereotypes. You've got the theater nerd, you have the jock, the cheerleader, the bad boy, the goth person, the gay guy. So you're seeing all these stereotypes that are represented in a TV show because it is an easy way to communicate and to separate people and to have identities. So, also, let's talk now about changing stereotypes. They are hard to change. We do not change them frequently. Um, we often, even when we are told something differently, so we have evidence that that stereotype is not true, many of us often cling to wrong beliefs. I think that's one thing that education can help us with is becoming more aware, getting to know other people, getting to know things that are more complex and not quite as simple as stereotypes usually work. So there are some different ways that we can change our stereotypes. And one is the bookkeeping model. This is where we learn new contradictory information. And so we're maybe in small ways, small steps, we're adjusting our stereotype. We're getting new information. We're meeting someone who is a Muslim, who is so peaceful and so loving and such a good neighbor, that our stereotype maybe about Muslims is changing. Usually we need quite a bit of that repeated information to really truly change a stereotype. Because sometimes if it's just an individual, then we think, oh, that's an exception to the rule. So that's the bookkeeping model where we interact with more and more people. Again, I've said this before. I think that's one thing about college is great because we interact with people from different backgrounds, from an economic class, from racial differences, other states, other faiths, no faith, whatever it might be. And so we're interacting with other people, and it is a time when we maybe start developing some of that bookkeeping. We're getting that information that's helping us break down some stereotypes. Then there's the conversion model where we just throw away the old stereotype and we start again. We realize, you know what? My parents taught me this. I don't think this is right, and I'm going to try to start developing a new ideas about that group of people. So usually this is used when there's a lot of evidence that is contrary to the stereotype that you've been taught. And then there's the subtyping model. We create a new stereotype that is a subclassification of the existing stereotype. So maybe we have a boundary around a subclass. So we may have a stereotype for Americans. You go overseas, there are stereotypes of Americans as being loud, wearing white shoes. This before the white shoes started coming back. But boy, there's a lot of difference in someone who is a true New Yorker, who grew up in New York, and someone who maybe grew up in the Midwest or out on a farm, or someone that grew up in Oklahoma, or someone like me who moved a lot. And I have probably a lot of different aspects that make me me because I have a little bit of every place that I've lived. So you may have a stereotype for Americans, but then maybe someone might say, oh, but they're a New Yorker, so their New Yorker is different. Or they're not from New York, so they're not like that. So that's that subtyping model where you kind of have these different categories inside of a stereotype. So what can we do? There's a lot of subtle racism in the media. Who is owning the media is a key issue. We've talked about that. Historically, affluent white men have been the media owners. There are exceptions to that, but most of them today are still that. It's been passed through families. Um, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. It used to be owned by the Graham family, and Katharine Graham was the owner of it for many years. And then her son took over, and then he sold it. So minorities, though, are developing alternative media and becoming very successful. I know Damon was showing me an Instagram Oh, Damon, I can't even think of the name of it off the top of my head, but he was showing me an Instagram that has been very successful. Um, and it's really devoted more to African Americans. Sorry, I can't think of the name of it. And so a lot of women and minorities and maybe conservatives and liberals, whomever it might be, they're trying to change the media from within. So they may have their own radio talk show and they're getting their own podcast and they're trying to get their viewpoints out there. So we have a lot more variety today, which is, I think, is a positive thing for us. Okay, I'm going to talk about there are some ways to fight stereotypes, and I will post that online on Friday, and we'll talk more about that when we meet in our Google Meet. So there were two or three things that you're supposed to be able to talk about. So be ready to discuss those things on Friday when we get together next. Thanks.